Okay, folks, welcome. It's good to see the increase in numbers. This afternoon we're starting on Revelation chapter 17, and we're going to be looking at basically three areas. We're going to look at chapter 17 in its context in Revelation, so we see how it's connected to chapter 16, 15, and it's connected to chapter 18. So that's the first area. And then once we've done that, we will move on and we'll look at the structure of chapter 17. We're not going to go into details. We're just going to get the broad overview. And then the third point I want to make this afternoon is to look at the focus of the chapter. What really is the heart of chapter 17? Because it's full of detail. And we can get lost in the detail as we travel through the chapter. And we can come to the end. And if we're not focused on the main point the chapter's about, we can sometimes miss it, and we come out with a lot of details but without a focus. So that's what we do. Next week we're going to look at Babylon, the woman, and the week after we will look at the beast with the 7 heads and the 10 horns, and then the week after, that's 4 weeks time, we'll be looking at how chapter 16 and 17 fit together, and how chapter 17 expands on and helps us to understand certain aspects of the 7 last plagues, the bowl plague. So that's the next 4 weeks work. And then we'll go into chapter 18, and then we finish the bowl section of Revelation. All right, so we're going to look now at Revelation chapter 17 in its context. And the context of Revelation chapter 17 is actually to be found in chapter 15 and 16. It continues on from chapter 15 and chapter 16. So that's the first point. Now, in Revelation chapter 15 and verse 5, we've done this already, so it's just review, basically. We can move reasonably fast. John writes, "After this I looked, and the sanctuary of the tent of witness in heaven was opened." You remember that verse? That's verse 5. Okay. Now, we discussed the sanctuary of the tent of witness in heaven, and we noted that the tent of witness is it's a tabernacle covered by the tent on the outside. And so the tabernacle, or the sanctuary of the tent of witness, this is the sanctuary, this is the naos. And so this is what is opened. So the sanctuary naos, it's talking about the holy and the most holy places. And as it says, they're open. So these are areas here where only priests could enter and minister in the presence of God. And normally the action was from the outside to the inside. So the priests would move into, perform their functions basically in the holy place, except on the Day of Atonement when the high priest entered into the most holy place. And so in Revelation chapter 15 verse 5, the tabernacle, this is opened. We all right in this? We've covered this already. And so we move on now to verse 6. "And out of the sanctuary came 7 angels with 7 plagues, and they clothed in pure, bright linen with golden sashes around their chests." Okay, and so these diagrams are not the best, but I can't paint, so I'm just borrowing. These are the 7 angels, and what are they doing? They're coming out of the sanctuary. And so the 7 angels here are introduced. There's no definite article in verse 1. These are the ones that were in verse 1. No definite article there, but here there's a definite article as it's referring specifically back to the angels in verse 1. So these are the 7 angels with the 7 plagues, which are the last, because in them the wrath of God is finished. Okay, so they're coming out of the sanctuary. What can we say about them? Coming out of the sanctuary. What's their role? priests, because only priests go in and out of, and so these are angels who are priests. And notice how they're dressed. They're dressed in the clothes of priests, functioning white with the sashes. We saw this already in Revelation. Where did we see it? The dress. Candlesticks, chapter 1 and verse 12, where the Son of Man was dressed and he's standing in the midst of the candlesticks. So these angels are priests. They're serving as priests, and they're coming out of the sanctuary, so that confirms their priestly role. And they're emerging from ministering in the presence of God, and the action now, it's not going into the sanctuary, but it's going to be coming out of the sanctuary. So these angels are coming out of the very presence of God, where they have been basically ministering. And then we come to the next verse, verse 7. And one of the four living creatures, remember these? These are close to the throne. They lead out in the liturgy and the services of praise in the sanctuary in chapter 4 and chapter 5 of Revelation. And as the seven angels with the seven bowls come out of the sanctuary, one of the four living creatures gives to each one a bowl full of the wrath of God. Okay, so that's verse 7. Here the angels are coming out, and as they emerge out, they would be given by one of the four living creatures a golden bowl full of the wrath of God. Okay. Now, verse 8. As they emerge, they're given the bowls, and the sanctuary was filled with smoke from the glory of God. No one could enter the sanctuary until the 7 plagues were finished. So that's chapter 15. That's chapter 15, verse 8. And so here I've just put a small diagram in. The sanctuary fills with smoke. No man can enter the sanctuary until the 7 plagues are finished. We looked at this earlier. And this period here is the time for the 7 bowls, the time for the pouring out of the wrath of God. So that's the sanctuary vision, basically introducing the bowl section of Revelation. We all right on this? It's fairly straightforward, because now when we come to chapter 17 verse 1, notice what it says. One of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came to John and said, "Come, I will show you the judgment of the great prostitute who's seated upon many waters." All right. Yes, thank you. I should have told you, you've got a sheet there, a worksheet number 1. You could be marking on this if you wanted to. And so now we're seeing chapter 17 verse 1 is connected back to chapter 15. It's connected back to chapter 15. It's one of those 7 angels who had the 7 bowls who introduces chapter 17 to John. That's our first point. So we're seeing chapter 17 now, and its connection to Revelation chapter 15 and to chapter 16. All right. So the angel that's going to be conducting John through chapter 17 is one of these 7. Is one of these 7 angels who holds the wrath of God. So that's the first point. We've got a direct link between chapter 17 now and chapter 16. Because it's the angel, one of the angels in chapter 16, who is coming and introducing Revelation chapter 17 and its contents to John. He's the one who comes and gives to John. Notice what he says. This angel came and said to me, "Come." So he's giving an invitation to John. "I will show you the judgment of the great prostitute who's seated on many waters. And so one of the angels out of chapter 16 is going to be introducing to John and taking John through the vision and the contents of chapter 17 and verse 1. And then notice the second point it says in this chapter, and I want you to get this point clear because this affects our understanding of Revelation a number of ways. If you don't learn anything else, then please focus on the point that we're going to come up to in a few moments. What does the angel say? He says, "Come, I want to show you the judgment on the great prostitute." So he introduces the great prostitute, who it says is seated on many waters. So this is a second direct link between chapter 17 and chapter 16 because notice this is the third bowl in chapter 16. If you've got your worksheet, some of you working on it, your first worksheet, you may want to do a little bit of marking in the middle column on these verses. Notice what happens when the third angel pours his bowl into the rivers and the springs of water. What happens? They become as blood. Okay, so that's the third bowl plague. Freshwater sources become as blood. And the angel in charge of the waters says, I'll just pick out a few points, because these folks have shed the blood of saints and prophets, what has God done? He's given them blood to drink. We'll come back to this in a few minutes. And so this here is connected here. This here is connected to the third bowl. But notice what else the angel says. Notice what else he says. He says, "Just are you, O Holy One, who is and was," here it is, who is and was, "for you have brought" what? These judgments. What judgments? It's the bowls. Directly. So in Revelation, judgments are connected to the bowl plagues, particularly in the latter half, chapter 14 right through to Revelation chapter 17, 18. Are we clear on this? That's the point I want you to get. And again, it says, this is what they deserve because they've slain. They shed the blood of saints and prophets. You've given them blood to drink. This is what they deserve. Payback time. Papua New Guinea terms. Payback time. And I heard the altar saying, "Yes, Lord God the Almighty, true and just are" what? Yeah, so the judgments are definitely the bowl plagues. Are we clear on this? How does it affect our interpretation? First angel's message. Fear God, give glory to him, for the hour of his judgment has what? Has come. The hour of his judgment. Context. What are judgments? The plagues. And so it's announcing that the hour has come in which God's wrath is about to be poured out upon the earth. So that's the reason for the first angel's message. Fear God, give glory to him, and worship him. Why? Because God's wrath, God's judgments, God's plagues, bowls are about to be emptied out upon the earth. So get things sorted out because we're living right there at the end of time. This is the executive aspect of God's judgment. You following? It's not the investigative aspect. Because failing to see this connection, what we often do is we jump straight back into Daniel and say, this is the hour of God's judgment, 1844 to the end, and we interpret this in terms of an investigative judgment. But in Revelation, the context gives us the state that it is not an investigative aspect of judgment, but it is the executive aspect of God's judgment. That's what we've got in Revelation 14. So the first angel's message is impacted on by this. Now, the second thing is, I'll just move back. I think I'll move back. Come, I will show you the judgment of the great prostitute. What are judgments in the context of the bowls? They're plagues. And so we could interpret it by saying, I think I've got it on this next one. Sorry, need to straighten that out. Judgments are bowl plagues. And so what we get here is, come, I will show you the judgment of the great prostitute who's seated on many waters. Come, I'll show you the bowl plague. Come, I'm going to give you more information on one of the bowl plagues in Revelation chapter 16. Are we clear on this? So there's a close connection between chapter 17 and chapter 16. Are we all right on this? Okay. Sorry, I'm not sure. Let me just go back to this. Judgment on the great prostitute. Okay. So judgments are the bowl plagues. Now what I want to do is just go through chapter 16 very, very quickly with you. Because what we're going to do now is look at the bowl plagues, and then we'll get some idea of what the angel is talking about when he says, come, I'll show you the judgment on the great harlot. And this is new material. We haven't covered this in previous one. This is adding to what we did on chapter 16. Notice chapter 16 verse 2. First angel pours his bowl on the earth. What's the result? Painful sores came, and who's it being poured out on? The people who bore the mark of the beast and worshipped its image. Okay. Second plague, bowl emptied, verse 3, poured out on the sea. And what happens to the sea? It becomes like blood, and every living thing that was in the sea died. Okay. Third one, 16, 4 and 6. I've jumped over a little bit here. The third angel poured his bowl onto the rivers and the springs of waters. So it's poured on fresh water. And what happens? The fresh water also becomes like blood. And now folks have nothing to drink except the water, fresh water that's polluted and turned to blood. And then comes the fourth one. And notice the fourth one. The fourth angel poured his bowl on the sun. We've looked at this already. It was allowed to scorch people with fire. And what did they do? They cursed God. They did not repent. And they give him glory. So folks, when we look at those first four bowls, there's a couple of things that we notice. And the first thing we notice is earth, sea, springs of waters, and the sun. Remember we looked at how God's deconstructing the earth, getting everything ready for the new heavens and the new earth. So we've got here the deconstruction of the earth. It's commencing here in the first four. Okay, and who's it targeting? It's targeting the people who bore the mark of the beast and worshipped its image. These are the ones who curse the name of God here under the fourth one. And these are also the ones who are given blood to drink. Are we all right on this? Yep. Okay. So that's the point that I want you to get. Now notice the next plagues. The fifth angel, you can't see much here, can you? And of course you can't, because the fifth angel poured his bowl on the throne of the beast, and its kingdom was in darkness. So who's receiving the fifth bowl? It's the beast and its kingdom. Okay. And then we come to the second. The sixth angel poured his bowl on the great Euphrates, and its water was dried up. So that's the sixth. And then we come to the seventh. And the seventh angel poured his bowl into the air, And we know from the last verse, which I've left up, great hailstones fell. But it also mentions verse 18, peals of thunder, great earthquake, and the great city, which is Babylon, the great city Babylon, split into 3 parts, and the cities of the nations fell. So who's being targeted, really targeted under the 7th bowl? Babylon. Are we clear on this? So it's the religious powers, it's the beast and its kingdom, which is worldwide. The Euphrates is being targeted. Now, what do we know about the Euphrates? It's the river associated with Babylon. So by targeting this Euphrates, it's preparatory to this one, which is targeting Babylon itself. We okay on this? And so what we're getting is the last 3 bowls are targeting Babylon itself. So the first 4 are targeting the worshippers. We clear? Those who get the mark of the beast. But the last 3, they are targeting Babylon. And so we're getting a progression here. All right, first 4 bowl plagues commence the deconstruction of the earth. I'm sorry for those of you who've just come in, but we've discussed this by looking at the 7 bowls in relationship to the days of creation, and seen in Revelation, in Genesis chapter 1, God starts with the abyss, and then he begins to give it form in the first 4 days. And then in the next 2 days, what does he do? He fills it with life. And then you get that Sabbath, the day of celebration, which caps creation. And then we saw, as we went into the trumpets and the bowls in particular, God starts now. And he's deconstructing. He's going through those first 4 days and the first 4 bowls, and he's beginning to break things apart until we finally start to come into the deconstruction of the earth. Now the target of the first 4 bowls is the worshippers of the image. We okay on this? The last 3 bowls complete the deconstruction of the earth with that great earthquake. What does it do? It shatters the whole planet. Mountains collapse and islands rush away. And the target now is on Babylon itself. It's on the great harlot. So when the angel comes in chapter 17 verse 1 and says to John, "Come, I will show you the judgment on the great harlot," he's talking about these last 3 bowls. Are we clear on this? So chapter 17 is going to be related, and we'll show this. We've got work to do yet, but it's related to the last 3 bowl plagues. So here it is, Revelation 17:1. "Come, I will show you the judgment of the great prostitute who's seated on many waters." The great prostitute is Babylon. We'll prove that next week. And the judgment are the bowl plagues, chapter 5 to 7. Clear on that? And the 7 angels are one of the angels carrying the bowls 5 through to 7. And so just summarizing, the angel in chapter 17:1 is either angel 5, 6, or 7. For these were the judgments specifically on the great harlot, Babylon. So we're starting to see chapter 17 in context. The judgment on the great harlot is going to come out of bowl 5 to 7. And the angel who's coming to show John the judgment or the bowl plague on Babylon has got to be one of those 3 angels, one of the last 3 angels. So Revelation 17 is going to give us a lot more information on bowl 5 to 7. That's the point I want you to get. Are we all right on this? Okay. I keep saying, are you all right? Because I'm a teacher rather than a preacher, and teachers always kind of want feedback to assure them that they're communicating, whereas preachers stand up and they just talk, and whether you get it or not, it's your fault, not theirs. So that's the problem. All right, now just give me a moment. Because I need to open up a new PowerPoint. It'll come in a minute, I hope. Oh yes, okay. Now, in your notes, you've got 3 sets of notes there stapled together. So if you just open them up so you know where we're going, about 3 pages in, we've just covered the first 3 pages of your notes, huh? And so now we're looking at the structure of Revelation chapter 17. All right, we'll just pause for a few moments. Are there any questions on what we've just covered?
When you refer to Babylon, are you meaning the people that don't believe in Christ, or you mean?
No, we'll define Babylon next week from Revelation. So we'll define it specifically. I'm sorry, I'm throwing out names. Those who've been in the seminar, we did touch on this some time ago, but your question's good. We're doing what Revelation does, because what Revelation does is it throws something onto the screen and it doesn't explain it until later. And so in chapter 14, you get Babylon has fallen. Suddenly Babylon appears for the first time. You don't know who she is or what she is. And it's only when you get into the chapters afterwards that you begin to get a realization of what she is. And so next week, I encourage you to come along. Next week we'll be looking at the identity of Babylon from Scripture. Okay. All right. Now we're looking at the structure. We're just going to go through chapter 17 and read the verses. And as we read the verses in Revelation chapter 17, there should be a second worksheet, which is just chapter 17. And if you want to scribble on it as we're going, feel free. So that will be the second of your worksheets. Now, chapter 17, verse 1. Let's read it again. One of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came and said to me, that's to John, "Come, I'll show you the judgment of the great prostitute who's seated upon many waters." So we're introduced to the great prostitute, or the great harlot. And she's said here to be seated on what? This is very important, but we'll pick that up a bit later. So what's happening here in verse 1? John is given an invitation. Would that be correct? He's not seeing her. He's just given an invitation to come with the angel. And the angel's got something he wants to show John. So John first hears about this harlot. He hears about her. Always in Revelation, in the visions, you get the hearing aspect. I heard the number of those sealed in Revelation chapter 7, and it goes on 144,000 from every tribe. He hears it, doesn't see it. And then you come down to verse 8, and he looks, and behold, a great multitude. So then he sees what he's heard about. We clear on this? And so here he hears about this great prostitute who's seated upon many waters. Invitation extended. Come, he is to be shown the judgment on the great harlot, i.e., the plagues that will be poured out upon her. So that's verse 1. Verse 1. A lot to unpack in it, but we'll look at that at another stage. And she's said to be seated on many waters. Okay, no surprises there. Now notice verse 2. It's beginning to give a description of this woman sitting on many waters, and it describes her. She's a prostitute in verse 1, yeah? What makes her a prostitute? Verse 2 tells us. Verse 2. With whom the kings of the earth have committed sexual immorality. So she's got illicit relationships with the political powers of the earth. We'll look more at this later on. And notice what else has happened. With the wine of whose sexual immorality, the dwellers of the earth have become drunk. So she's not only committed fornication, spiritual fornication with the political powers of the earth, but that political, that illicit relationship, that's the words I want, that illicit relationship between the kings of the earth and Babylon have impacted on the dwellers of the earth. And we'll see in verse 8, it'll tell us a bit more about these dwellers on the earth. And I just want you to notice two things here. One thing here of importance, it's distinguishing between two groups that are impacted on by Babylon. Do you see that in the text? Two groups. Because folks, the way to learn Revelation is simply to read the text and focus on the text and see what's in the text. And that's what we're doing here. So what are the two parties that are being impacted on by Babylon? Right, the kings of the earth and the dwellers on earth. Let's keep that in mind, because when it comes to the interpretation of Revelation, this is a key point.
I know I'm jumping ahead a bit, but I presume the reference to sexual immorality is to do with the religious with the secular.
Yes, basically. And we'll look later at the wine too, and how this religious secular combination impacts on the earth through the wine. Well, what does it mean, the wine? But we'll look at that later. Okay, now we come into verse 4. Verse 4. I think I've missed a verse. Have I missed a verse? Read verse 3, somebody. Read verse 3.
And he carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was full of blasphemous names.
Yep.
7 heads and 10 horns.
Okay. And so now he's carried away into the wilderness in the spirit. So he's in vision. And he goes to a wilderness. And this is where he sees seated on a beast. What was she seated on in the invitation John was given? What was she seated on? On many waters. And it's not waters that it is that when we see what the significance of this is, but it is quite significant, and it may even relate to kings of the earth versus the dwellers. It may relate to that. And now it describes a woman in purple pearls, and she's holding in her hand a golden cup. Tell us about the woman.
Not the best sort.
Well, that comes out of the preceding verses, that she's a prostitute, yes? But who she's the consort of? She's the consort of the kings of the earth, huh? So what would she be? The queen. And you go to chapter 18, she says, a queen I sit. A queen I sit. And so this is not the dress of prostitutes. You following this? Her behaviours are driven to prostitutes, but her position is portrayed in purple, which purple is the colour of royalty, of nobility, of the emperors. And so this is her, and she's being presented as a queen. And look at the luxury. She's gold and jewels and pearls. And in her hand she's got this golden cup, but the content of the cup, yes, full of abominations and the impurity of her sexual immorality. So filthy contents of the cup. Here's the contents through this sexual immorality, this union of the kings of the earth with Babylon, the inhabitants of the earth. Are we right on this? So we're beginning to see in these verses, we're getting the vision, the actual vision. This is shown. He's being shown the woman. Being shown the woman. And it goes on in verse 5 and says, on her forehead was written a name of mystery. Babylon the Great. She's a mother of prostitutes and the mother of, it's missed out here, but of the earth's abominations. And 17:6a, I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints and the blood of the martyrs. Who has been attacking and destroying God's church and God's people on earth. And how's she going to do it? Through her alliance with the kings of the earth and by controlling the dwellers on earth. So that's all coming out of the text itself. And so she's coming now onto the stage, described in the few verses, and this is in preparation for the judgment. These are some of the reasons why judgment's coming on her, will be coming on her. And John says, when I saw her, I marvelled greatly. And in 7:6b, I saw her, I marvelled greatly. So there's an outline, and you'll find this outline if you open on the last sheet of that section B. Section B, just second last sheet in the collection. That's in your notes. There's a diagram there. You've got the diagram in your notes. That's the first part of it. Okay, so John invited in the first two verses to view the judgment of the great harlot. In verses 3 to 6, he sees her drunk with the blood of the saints, and she's seated on a scarlet beast with 7 heads and 10 horns. And then in verse 6b, we get John's reaction to the vision he made greatly. So that's the structure of the first part of Revelation chapter 17. We okay on this? We'll just outline those verses. Come on, over the page, over the page. There you go. You all got it? The diagram? Okay, because what we're going to do now, if we're all clear on this, we've just outlined. So all you need to do is read a chapter, get the key points out and summarise the contents of each. No need to go to a book or a commentary and look for a diagram that gives you the structure. Work it out from the chapter itself. With the text, you start to become familiar with the text itself. So there's basically 3 moves. John's invited to view the judgment, and then he's shown the great harlot, and then he reacts to the vision in the last part of it. He marvels greatly. All right. Now, verse 7. The angel said to me, you marvel. And now we're getting this marvel business, and it's moving us into the second major section on chapter 17. The angel said to me, "Why do you marvel? I'll tell you the mystery of the woman and of the beast with 7 heads and 10 horns." So what's the angel say to John in verse?
What's the meaning?
Yeah, I'm going to explain for you. And so the vision in those first 6 verses is going to be followed by an explanation of the woman. Who is she? John, who is she? And secondly, the beast. And thirdly, he's going to talk about the horns, the heads, and he's going to tell us what the horns are. So with Revelation, we don't have to guess at this. We've just got to see the connections. You following? Just got to note the connections. And same with Daniel. Just note the connections. The vision, the interpretation that follows. Giving a Bible study, all you have to do is point out the connections. Let the Bible speak. Don't you speak. Let the Bible speak. Because it's very powerful when the word is allowed to speak. Probably 74. I took my first trip out of Fulton College, had holidays, and I thought, I'll go across to Tonga. Have I told you the story before? No, I'll go across to Tonga and I'll run some seminars. So I wrote, a guy called Pastor John Lee was the president at that stage. He said, "Yep, come over. I've got something for you to do." And so he put me in the layman's school. I went to the main church in Tonga to run a series on Revelation. And so when I struck the church, I couldn't get a word in. The question. 3 nights I couldn't even get into the seminar because it was just being fired with questions. And so what I did, if they got questions they want to know, and so I opened my Bible and I just fielded the questions itself. About the 3rd, 4th night, towards the end of the 3rd night, 4th night, everything quietened down and I actually got into the seminar itself. Well, I went to Tonga one of the Tongan ministers came to me and he said, "Hey, you remember when you were here last time?" I said, "Yes." He said, "And you remember the church at Mangaia?" That was the main church in Nuku'alofa. And I said, "Yes." And he said, "You remember all those questions they asked?" And I the question, he said, "And why were they asking you questions?" Now, I didn't have a clue because they're absolutely naive, you see. I thought they asked questions because they wanted answers. I said, "I don't know." And he said, "Well, when you stepped off the plane and you were walking across the tarmac to come into the country, they saw you." And they said, "Is that Cavanagh? Who's this?" And suddenly it all into 3 nights. Show that here the comes materials, you see, because whatever. And so then he asked this question, he said, "Do you know why they were quiet after 2 to 3 nights?" And I said, "No." He said, "Because of the way you answered the question." I just said to him, "How did I answer the questions?" Because I didn't answer them. I just answered them, you see. Talk about naive. I just answered them the way I normally answered questions. He said, "Whenever they ask, you open the Bible, you put your finger on a text, and you let the text speak and answer the question." He said, "If you had spoken out of your mouth instead of out of the word, you would have been lost." And so that's a big lesson. I look back on that and I think, wow. I often used to say to ministers who are in training, get to know the word, and when people ask you questions, don't just mouth, but go to the Bible, put your finger on a text, and let the text speak. And that's what we've got to do with Revelation, you see. It's learn to let the texts speak when people ask questions. All right, so there's the first one, verse 7. The angel announces he'll explain the vision in verse 6. And then in verse 8, he moves and he says, the beast you saw was, is not, and is about to rise from the bottom of the pit. And he comes up in chapter 11, and go to destruction. And the dwellers of the earth, whose names have not been written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, will marvel to see the beast, because it was, is not, and is to come. We'll deal with this in detail. But this is a comment. He's not giving an explanation. He's not identifying any of the symbols. He's just making a comment in verse 8, which moves the plot forward. This tells us that the dwellers on the earth, in verse 2, who become drunk with the wine of her fornication, these are the ones whose names have not been written in the Lamb's book of life from the foundation of the world. So these are the ones who are outside of a saving relationship with God. Because instead of being related to God, who are they related to? They're related to the beast. And they'll be related to the world. See a little bit later. So it moves the plot forward. Dwellers of the earth are marveling because the beast has been resurrected. He's been dead. He was and is not dead, but he is to come. He has been risen from the dead. So the resurrection of this beast caused the whole world, resurrection to power, has caused the whole world to marvel at the beast and its resurrection. So these verses 7 and 8 are basically commentary. Following this? Angel says, I'll explain to you, and he gives a bit of comment, and then in verse 9 and 10 he talks about the 7 heads, are 7 mountains on which the woman's seated. So here's interpreting the 7 heads. We okay on this? So now we've got comment, and then we've got these verses which deal with the meaning of the 7 heads. We'll be looking at this in a 3 weeks' time. So the 7 heads are explained. And then in verse 11, he moves on and he talks about the beast. We're clear on this? So now he's going to give us some information we'll just understand about the beast. So he's going to explain the beast itself. This is in verse 7. And then in verse 11. And then in verse 12, he talks about the 10 kings who have not yet received royal power, but they will. So the 10 horns are interpreted. We clear on this? So he's and 10 and 11, and he's dealt with the heads, the beast, and the horns. And he's put them in that particular order because we need that order if we're going to understand them. That's 3 weeks' time, 2 weeks' time. And then another comment comes. That's the 10 horns, 10 kings are of one mind. They give their power and authority over to the beast. And it tells us that they give their authority and power to the beast for what purpose? To make war on the Lamb, but the Lamb will conquer them, for he's Lord of Lords and King of Kings, and those with him are called and chosen and faithful. And so we've got comment number 2 in verses 13 and 14. Okay. Activities of the 10 horns, they turn their power over to the beast and they make war on the Lamb. And then in verse 15, the angel comes and he gives explanation on the waters. The waters you saw where the prostitute is seated are peoples and multitudes, nations and languages. So the waters are interpreted. And then 16 and 17, we get another comment, the third block of comment in these verses. The 10 horns, they and the beast Remember what they were doing before? 10 horns and the beast. They're making war against the lamb, persecuting God's people. But now we're going to suddenly find in verses 16 and 17 that they turn in another direction. Notice this. The 10 horns you saw, they and the beast will hate the prostitute, make her desolate and naked, devour her flesh, burn her up with fire, for God has put it in their hearts to carry out his purpose by being of one mind and handing over their royal power to the beast until the words of God are fulfilled. We get now a third block. After the interpretation of the words, now we're told something more about the progress and the storyline. Horns and the beast who have been making war on the lamb will now make war on the prostitute herself. Folks, that's the heart. That's the judgment on the great. Turn against her. Okay, now we're just outlining the chapter, that's all. And then in the last verse, verse 18, he goes back and he talks about the woman that you saw is that great city that has dominion over the kings of the earth. And so in verse 18, the woman is explained. All right, so here it is. This is your diagram. You've all got that diagram. Don't get lost. This is in your notes. Second page. That's the one. And so verse 7, can you read this? I know it's a bit small, but I couldn't get it all onto one slide. In verse 7, the angel announces he'll explain the vision. Got that? Okay. Then, in verse 8, comment, one that moves the plot forward, dwellers of the earth marvel because the beast's resurrection to power. And then we come into verse 9 and 7 heads are. And then in verse 11, the beast. And then in verse 12, the horns are interpreted or explained. Okay on this? And then we go back and we get another comment 2, which talks about the activities of the beast and the horns in relationship to the. And then we come into verse 15 and we are back to interpretation. The waters. And guess what? After the waters, we get our third block. Now, you don't have to memorize this, but it just guides you if you're aware of this break of explanation with commentary series. It'll help you just to understand and work your way through the chapter better. And so in verses 16 and 17, the third comment, horns and beasts who have been making war on the lamb now make war on the prostitute. And finally, in verse 18, we get the woman explained. We got that? Okay. That's the outline of the chapter. Notice verse 7 to 18, explanation interspersed with comments that move the narrative. If I was to ask you, Revelation chapter 17 contents, you could all say it's got a vision, first 6 verses, followed by explanation interspersed with comments in verses 7 to 18. That's why that we will be able to interpret and understand about the woman seated on the beast with 7 heads and 10 horns. All right, one last comment. Focus of the chapter, and this is the last sheet on your page. The focus. As I've said in chapter 17, hey, look at all the detail we're given. You got a woman, you got waters, you got horns, you got beasts, you've got heads and prostitutes. And the danger is, by the time you've gone through a series of studies and you've worked out what these all mean, you forget that it's got a focus. And so you come out at the end and you've got all the details about heads and horns and beasts and women, and you know what they mean. You've have lost the focus of the chapter. Now, will show. That's the focus of the chapter. We all right on this? So when we're working our way through all of those details, we should always keep in mind what is the judgment. These details we need to understand, but how do they contribute to us understanding what the judgment of the harlot is? I'll give you the answer now. This, verses 16 and 17. That's the focus. That's the judgment. Chapter 6. When the woman who's been sitting on that beast and directing it and riding it and moving it loses control over it. Why? Because God has put it into their minds. At this point of time, there's going to be a change. Fighting against God's church and God's people, they now turn their attention on their rider and they attack it. So when the horns and the beast have been making war on the lamb, make war on the prostitute, that's it.
So Christ's enemies will try to destroy each other.
They do, right at the end. Folks, what we'll do later on is, now that we've found the focus, once we've found the focus and we understand those verses, sheet, I've given you 3 points. I think 3 points. Can I just borrow this? First point is, once we've identified this and gone through and we understand the chapter, this is the approach we're using to chapter 17. First, work out the details of chapter 17 so we understand about heads and horns and beasts and woman and waters. Okay? That we start next week on Sabbath. When we've done this and we've identified the focus of the chapter, which are those verses, ending of chapter 16, and we will relate it back to chapter 16, and suddenly you'll see chapter 16 in the light of chapter 17, and you'll look at it and you'll see how chapter 16 is being elaborated and expanded in chapter 17. So that's what we're going to be doing over the next 3 weeks, looking at this. And then by the time we finish chapter 17 and its relationship to chapter 16, you'll know exactly which angel it is that comes to John and says, "Come, I will show you the judgment on the great harlot." And you'll know what the judgment on the great harlot is in relationship to the bowls, the 7 bowls. And folks, there'll be one period I'll spend on great controversy, because there's some amazing material in great controversy. If we'd read this earlier and understood how great controversy and the sections on the bowl plagues relates to chapter 17, I think we would be a lot further ahead as a church. So we'll have one session on spirit of prophecy in relationship to Revelation chapter 17 and the bowl plagues. All right, so that's our plan for the next few weeks. Folks, through and get the broad sweep of what we've covered, yeah? That's the important thing. Know the structure, be able to see the bowls, chapter 17 in the context of the bowl section, how it's building on chapter 15 and 16. That's the first point. And then the second point is become familiar with the structure of the chapter. Just read it. And as you read it, see it falling into those blocks that we've outlined. All right, folks, thank you for your time.